The PlayStation 5 has been out for a couple of years now, and a lot of people really enjoy the system. I personally am a big fan of the hardware. And one of the things that I always get really interested in is when stories of development kits start to appear for sale on sites such as eBay. This particular listing just occurred a couple of days ago, and that has to do with a PlayStation 5 prototype appearing on Yahoo Japan. Now, if you take a close look at this, you can see it's a Prototype 2 not for sale. And this has a very similar look to a PlayStation 5 development kit that we've seen in the past. But what you'll notice is this is a Prototype 2 not for sale, and it also has a Blu-ray drive built into it. Now, I can tell you that a retail PlayStation 5 development kit does not have the Blu-ray drive, and there's some differences here as well with a retail system. I couldn't specifically tell you what they are, but looking at this, I can tell you that there's definitely some differences between the final release of the PlayStation 5 dev kit. Now, what's interesting about this is that this PS5 Prototype 2 is currently on Yahoo Auctions Japan. Now, this is obviously a very, very popular buying and selling website, Yahoo Japan Auctions, where you can either buy products or list products. And there's always some really interesting and exotic things for sale on Yahoo Japan. Now, as you can see, the PS5 Pro Dev Kit is currently being listed for 500,000 yen, which is the equivalent of, at least of the making of this episode, $3,615. As you can see, it's finished up at 702,000 yen, or the equivalent of $5,075.46 with 68 bids. So there's obviously a lot of interest in something like this. Now, the seller has listed another PlayStation 5 development kit Prototype 2 model, and it's pretty much the same type of deal, a quick 24-hour auction, and we'll have to see how this one goes. But what's interesting about this is that Sony themselves either are not aware of this development kit being on Yahoo Japan, which I find very hard to believe, but you can see this is a quick auction, so I think the seller is trying to basically get it sold as quickly as possible before Sony themselves see this listing and take it down. Now, the question is, well, why does Sony actually need to take this listing offline? Isn't this the ownership of the person that's either selling the product or buying it? Why is Sony involved in this? Well, I've talked about this before, but development kits are very, very interesting. It's one of those things where the hardware maker doesn't really want them getting out in the wild. They want to continue to kind of maintain control of all of them and account for all of them. So the way that development kits work in game development is that when you work at a particular studio, you have access to these development kits. Now, usually these development kits are not sold. They're not like sold to you where you just purchase one and then you retain ownership of them. They're actually kind of lent out to you, or they're given out to you for a duration of time. And at the end of that duration, whether the person that's working with a development kit leaves the studio, then they have to return their kits either back to the account holder or back to the hardware maker themselves. So what I mean by that is, let's throw out this particular scenario. So let's say that I work for Limited Run Games, which is what I do, and I work with a PlayStation 5 development kit. I have allocated a dev kit, and once I decide that I want to kind of leave the company or something like that happens, or maybe the company gets sold or something like that, then that particular ownership that I have of that development kit has kind of lapsed, and it's then kind of my responsibility or the company's responsibility to then return that hardware back to Sony. And usually they do this because there is a finite amount of development kits that are out there. It's nothing in the same fashion as like retail systems, for example. So dev kits, there is a lot less of them out in the world. They usually kind of make enough to kind of ensure that developers, no matter, if you're just a single developer, indie studio or a large AAA, there's enough dev kits to go around. But usually what happens in this scenario is, especially when there is a new generation of console that comes out, development kits are, offered to first parties, of course. They get first dibs on new hardware, and then kind of the larger AAAs, the larger kind of cross-generation AAA studios such as Ubisoft, Capcom, Electronic Arts, for example, they'll then, get dibs on dev kits, and then kind of the smaller indies after that will kind of get access to development kits as well. So going back to the original page here, I want to talk about the article that has been written by Wololo here. And they kind of talk about prototype consoles. Now, I think a prototype console is very interesting to a lot of people because a prototype is obviously something that is not made anymore. If I work as a developer and I get sent a PlayStation 5 dev kit, I'm not going to get a prototype because that's something that was a part of the kind of the initial launch of the hardware itself. Even before the retail launch, these prototype units were being sent to developers to build their games on, for example. So while there's probably some really great or interesting things that are on a prototype development kit, I think the real draw of a prototype console is really for collectors. Collectors love exotic hardware. They love, development kits that have scarcity or they're very, very rare. And for me, I feel like whoever looks at picking this up is probably going to be a collector that wants to collect, like I said, exotic kind of prototype style hardware. When I think about the Xbox line of products, there's a lot of different prototype units for dev kits that have been around, since the early days of the OG Xbox. The PlayStation 2, the PlayStation 3 had many, many different prototypes as well. So the idea of a prototype is very appealing to many collectors. Now, this is the part that I really want to talk about in more detail. Do console prototypes help the scene? Now, this is a really interesting question because there is a thought process that if you buy a development kit or if you end up with one, then you have like untapped access to come up with a way to help a retail system get exploited, for example. Unfortunately, these days, dev kits are all kind of locked out and they require activation. So what does that mean? Well, let me give you a real world example. If I took ownership of a PlayStation 5 development kit, basically that kit needs to be activated. And effectively what that means is Sony needs to be aware of the IP address that I'm using. So that particular IP address needs to be approved. And not only that, I also have to be a registered Sony developer. So my name or the email address that's tied to the place that I work needs to be approved by Sony as well. So those two pieces, and there's other information as well, need to be approved by Sony for this kit to be enabled. So what does that mean? Well, if I take my development kit from this location, and let's just say that this location has an IP address that is approved by Sony, and I take it somewhere else, let's say I go down the street to my neighbor's house, and he or she has a different IP address, then my kit will not work. It will expire because it's trying to connect back to Sony's servers and trying to get reactivated. Now, I have been informed that this particular prototype 2 potentially could help the scene in more ways than I was initially led to believe, and that has to do with an exploit that came out at the end of 2022 known as the Blu-ray Drive JB exploit, and this was released initially by The Flow. And because this prototype unit has a Blu-ray drive, it means there is the possibility, I'm not saying it's confirmed, someone would still need to buy this particular dev kit and try it for themselves, the potential to exploit the Blu-ray drive with the BD-JP exploit. So there could be more value than I was initially led to believe that would potentially help the scene with exploiting the PS5. If I think back to previous development kits, activation is something that has been around since about 2012, 2013, and it was kind of introduced during the era of the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4. Before that, on the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3, development kits did not require activation, but one of the the fallout or side effects of the Xbox 360 scene, where there was rampant piracy, there were people connecting to the PartnerNet service, was Microsoft kind of started to basically, ban development kits that they knew were coming from IP addresses that were not approved on their, on their list, for example. So I think the industry has really kind of come a long way when it comes to development kit. Now, taking a look at the pictures of this dev kit are quite interesting. This is another look at it, and you can see that it's very well used. I mean, obviously this came from a studio. Now we don't know which studio it has come from. Someone like Sony would have that information because based on the serial number on the back of the dev kit itself will give more information as to where it's come from. And that's one of the other things that hardware makers are very good at these days, and that is tracking dev kits. Even though this dev kit is on Yahoo Auctions right now, Yahoo Japan Auctions, it really only takes someone to connect it online or plug in a network cable, and then that's going to ping back information back to Sony and let them know, hey, this particular kit that potentially could have already been banned or whatever is trying to connect to the internet again, and it's trying to re-authenticate. So Sony, even though they probably aren't happy with this, they are also probably aware about what's going on, making sure that hardware makers are, making sure that they keep track of all their dev kits is something that's obviously very important to them. So I guess the last thing is, this is a very, very sexy piece of kit. I mean, I love the PlayStation 5 development kit. I think the look is awesome. I think if you are someone that does collect exotic hardware, this is probably something that's up your alley. And I think, it's probably only a matter of time before this dev kit actually gets sold. But that's all for today's episode, guys. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, please don't forget to put a like on it, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Bye for now.